authors to Birmingham, we've never experienced anything quite like this. When the folks at Riverhead Books, a division of Penguin Publishers, selected us for this event, we had many arrangements to make and huge expenses in an undertaking of this magnitude. Of course, you, the ticket holder, normally covers those costs, like is done when any rock star is touring. But not tonight. One of our state's finest companies wanted to give all Alabamians an opportunity to hear this remarkable man, so they picked up the tab. They helped make it possible for you to enjoy the show in this beautiful room with free indoor parking. And by the luck of the draw, a handful of you got to go to a little meet and greet. I guess that's like winning the lottery. So now everyone gets to enjoy the show, go home with a keepsake ticket and a signed first edition of what we think will be the book of the year. All for less than the normal retail price of the book. And what's even more amazing, they elected to be anonymous. Quite a few of you, when you picked up your tickets, asked me to thank them, and I have. Since they have several representatives in the audience tonight, here is your opportunity to do just that. Thank you, generous secret sponsor. Standing ovation for a secret sponsor. This is just another reason why it's great to be in Alabama. Before we bring out our distinguished guests, or even share with you what you will see and hear tonight, let me divulge that this is the second trip for our speaker to Birmingham. And there are more people on this section of the front row than were at his signing for the Kite Runner on February 10th, 2005. The point of that enlightenment is that next time you have an opportunity to meet a debut author, go for it. They may grow up to be Khaled Hosseini. Here's what you're going to see this evening. First, you'll be treated to a short video about the Khaled Hosseini Foundation. Then he will join us at this table and answer and elaborate on questions that we have created in the last 6 months since we've known he's coming. And in case we've missed something that you're curious about, we will take your questions. I've got a stack of them on the table, and they're going to bring me a few more in case there were some late folks. In between the questions, we'll take a break, and the author might be encouraged to read a little bit so you can get a feel for the story in his voice. Then we'll have closing remarks and we'll get out of here. As you leave the ballroom, please stop by the Hosseini Foundation table. We have volunteers who will give you more information. We're not taking any money, but take this bookmark, and it'll give you a link to his site. And if you're so moved, we'd love to hear from you. Here's another table, manned by volunteers from the Alabama Booksmith. And there you may pick up extra signed copies of And the Mountains Echoed, The Kite Runner, 1,000 Splendid Suns. And I checked the internet this morning before coming down here, and signed copies of this guy's books are selling for a lot of money, an awful lot of money. And it might not be a bad idea to do a little early gift shopping. And speaking of gifts, after this video, let's meet a wonderful gift to the world of literature. His first two books, The Kite Runner and 1,000 Splendid Suns, so far have sold in excess of 38 million copies in 70 countries. The Kite Runner was on the New York Times bestseller list for 100 weeks. 1,000 Splendid Suns was also a New York Times #1 bestseller and was named by the American Booksellers Association as Book of the Year. We think, more importantly, it was picked by our Signed First Editions Club for our June 2007 selection. Few writers have had life's experiences to allow them to give their readers such compelling stories. He was born in Kabul, Afghanistan, to a high school teacher and a career diplomat. After relocating to Paris, his family was granted political asylum in the United States. He completed undergrad work at Santa Clara University and graduated from the University of California, San Diego Medical School. Until 2004, he was a practicing physician. He is a goodwill and envoy for the United Nations Refugee Agency and created the Khaled Hosseini Foundation, which you'll see a short video in just a moment. And I guess now, if you will please show us the video, and then we will meet our guest tomorrow.
Afghanistan had one of the largest refugee crises of the last century.
The situation in Afghanistan is very dire right now.
At one point, there were 8 million Afghans, that's roughly a third of the Afghan population, who lived abroad as refugees, mainly in Iran and in Pakistan.
These people coming back from Pakistan or Iran or internally displaced, they have no place to live. And when they do find a place, or if they can't afford a piece of land, they generally don't have the materials or the money to buy a shelter.
It's very difficult to get by with your life and try to get a job and provide for your children and have them go to school and do the things everybody wants to do. If you're homeless, if you're living under a tent, or living squatting out in the open in the middle of nowhere, and I saw entire communities like this of people sleeping out in the open, living in holes on the ground throughout an entire winter. Really heartbreaking.
When I look at the footage of Khaled over in Afghanistan, it really tears at my heart knowing that I have 3 children and my family could have been in a similar situation like that. What I really want to do is make an impact to help those families help themselves.
The needs for these returning refugees are great. There's great opportunity to help these people and to help them help themselves. And that's why I've decided to focus a great deal of our efforts through the foundation on the issues of refugees, specifically shelter and the problems of homelessness. In virtually every village I went to in Afghanistan, shelter was the primary need. I'll never forget walking into these villages and just the casual way with which the elders would say that every winter they lose 5, 10, 15 children due to the cold, largely because they're exposed to these unforgiving elements of the freezing temperatures. I can't even begin to imagine what it must be like to watch your kid die, watch your child freeze to death right before your eyes because you don't have a roof over your head. So the shelters will also help provide these people with home, with safety, with comfort, and will help save lives.
This foundation supports humanitarian efforts in Afghanistan. The foundation partners with the UN to build shelters for
a roof over an entire family's head, to provide a home for a family.
and that provides everything that a family needs to build their house. They build it themselves with mud bricks, and the UN provides the materials and some of the overhead costs to build the shelters. But for very little money, we can give these people just the very basic elements they need to survive this winter. As long as there are people there who need us, we're their hope, and they depend on us. There are no social welfare programs in Afghanistan that can help these people. We're the only people who can help. They're relying on the international community to help them. And we can help in many ways. We can help by being aware of their situation. We can help by not giving them hope. We can help by supporting the foundation in its events. Schools can help.
We decided that we would make the cornerstone of our efforts with various schools across this country SOS, that's a Student Outreach for Shelter. And it's really simple. You read the book in a classroom, and then instead of just kind of sitting on that knowledge, you turn it around and you turn it into action.
One of the goals of the SOS program was to be able to develop a turnkey program that any school would be able to adopt. Everything is online, maps, curriculum, fundraising, tips, whatever you need to make this successful, you'll be able to access through the website.
What I want to tell people is that there's always something you can do as an individual, as a classroom, as a congregation, as a community. There's always something you can do, and nothing that you do is too small. Everything that you do matters. And that's part of our mission with this foundation, is to take your goodwill and turn it around into help, into some kind of benefit for some really vulnerable people.
Ladies and gentlemen, Khaled Hosseini.
Thanks very much.
Oh boy, thank you. We're kind of glad to have you in Alabama again.
I'm glad to be back. Look at all this crowd. Wonderful. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Good Lord.
If we increase every time I come back with your next book, if we keep exponentially bringing a
That
crowd.
crowd that I had in Alabama in 2005 was huge compared to what I was getting in 2003. I wanted double digits, that's all I wanted. So it's like nice to have seen that, so that I can and have a sense of perspective and appreciate this tremendous turnout. I'm really touched. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, we have a bunch of questions, and the audience has a bunch of questions, so if you're ready, we'll fire away.
Okay, let's do it.
You're seeing readers across America, and what excites you about that prospect?
Well, it's nice to meet people whose lives are touched in some way, could be minor or more, by my thoughts, by things that I've put on paper. And I'll meet people. My readership is very, in some ways, unique, because I will meet people from the age of 9, 10, 11, all the way to 90 or more. You know, it's incredible. And it's, to me, it's just amazingly humbling to go and see what a huge swath of sort of demographic my stories have touched. It's nice to be at home and write books, which is what writers really want to do, but I think it's also nice to go on the road and actually meet the people who read your books and hear their thoughts and thank them for supporting me.
That's a great answer. We experienced some of that coming over from the hotel.
We did. We ran into some very nice folks who said hello, and
it's a little more than hello. if you walked into this guy in a hotel, I bet you'd say a little more than hello. You've been on the road now for 5 weeks.
Yes, I left home May 18th.
What are you planning to read on the tour?
Well, people always give me books to read. Let's see, I actually read a lot on tour. I'm not a fast reader. My wife is a ridiculously fast reader. We went to Italy last summer, and we were there, I think, 2 weeks in Italy, and she read 7 books. So, gives you an idea of how fast she reads. But I'm a little slower, but I've managed to go through almost 4 novels now since I left. So I began with a short story collection by Alice Munro called Dear Life, which was sublime as always. She's one of my favorites. Then I read a book that written by another Penguin author called Mohsin Hamid. He wrote a book called How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. Have you read that? I recommend it. It's really good. It's about this guy in an unnamed South Asian country, which is probably Pakistan, and how he starts dirt poor, and he becomes basically a tycoon. And it's sort of this old-fashioned story about rags to riches, and it's a lovely love story. And it sort of sets cleverly in a kind of self-help book format. So it's 8 chapters, 8 points that you have to do to get rich in Rising Asia.
How long ago did you read that book?
I read it on a plane like a couple of weeks ago.
And has it worked so far?
What's that other book I read? Dave Edgar's book. Hologram for the King. Fantastic. Everybody should read that. It's just a beautiful reflection on where America is today and post-recession America. It's just a wonderful book. And now I've started reading, one of the perks of publishing a book is you get a lot of, it's both a perk and occasionally it's kind of a nuisance. You get a lot of arts, one of these advanced review copies. But occasionally you'll get one from somebody that you admired for a long time. And I'm reading the new one by June Lahiri called The Lowland. It's gonna knock the socks off. It's a lovely book. So I'm about finished with that.
Great writer.
Yes.
I know a little inside information on this, but share with the audience. What do you like to do with your downtime during the tour?
During the tour?
Yeah.
Downtime in the tour. I wasn't aware there was such a thing, but I'm basically just grateful to sleep and shower. I do read on airplanes. I use the gym here.
That's what
I use the gym here just to keep some form of kind of health going. But book tours are very strange things. I know another author here.
I believe her name is.
Yeah, Patty Henry.
Callahan.
She's here. She's here. I don't know where she is, but
Raise
she's
her
here.
hand, Patty. Don't be shy.
There she is. She's right there. And she is a resident author, and she's toured before, and so I'm sure she knows that when you tour, it's a bizarre, weird thing, because at once you're with 1 million people, and you shake a lot of hands, you take pictures, you meet a lot of people, and yet paradoxically, it's one of the most solitary things you can do, is that you're kind of on your own, and you go from one crowd to the next, and you're kind of like the person in the room that you end up being, so that's why I read a lot, you know, on my book tours, and I exercise, and then, you know, I'm grateful to have the time to do anything else. Terrible way of seeing cities, by the way. I've seen nothing of Birmingham. I've seen Stockholm and Oslo and Copenhagen and Dublin from the back of a taxi cab. I couldn't tell you the first thing about any of those cities. You don't see the cities, you know, you just kind of go from one thing to the next.
Penguin won't let you spend a week in each city?
You know, the economics of publishing have changed now.
What's something you might pack in your suitcase that would surprise the audience?
Oh, geez, I thought this was going to be a different kind of interview. That might surprise the audience. I've got to get clever. I packed a little flip. I don't know if you've seen those little flip video camera, those flip cam things of my kids. And I asked, my kids like to sing and play guitar and piano. So I asked them to put little numbers together for me before I leave. That way I can watch it when I'm on the road. And so my son's a pretty good singer. My daughter plays piano. And he did a really lovely version of that old song, Blue Moon. Remember that song? And he likes Patsy Cline, so he put together a little Patsy Cline. Elizabeth Cotton. He's 12 years old, but he's like, he's a middle-aged man stuck in a toilet. He texted me the other day. He's like, remember, when you get home, I haven't been watching. We have a Mad Men marathon to go through. How old is this kid? So,
what I was trying to pull out of you is talking with Jim Martin, your publicist. She mentioned that occasionally you pack a traveling guitar.
oh well, my guitar. I'm a horrible player, but I took it on as an act of solidarity for my children because I made them take music lessons, and I figured that if I took something on as well, then they would be more inclined to play. I'm not sure to what degree that's been successful. I thought my son would be really thrilled about it, and he had a recital coming up, and I said, well, you know, why don't we learn a song together, and I'll get on stage with you and play. And he looked at me like, when I asked him to stick his hand in the garbage disposal, he's like, no, that's not going to happen. I'm like, one day you will be older and you will regret what you just said.
Well, this is Father's Day, and I know you are in touch constantly with your children. How are they handling the tour?
I see them on all my local events. So I've been to California twice already, and they go with me to my local events. So they pack up with me, and we went to the wine country where I had an event in Santa Rosa. I had something in Santa Cruz, and then they're going to meet up with me in Chicago, where I speak at the ALA, American Library Association. And so they will be in Chicago with my wife there, and we'll have a day together, I guess. So they're handling it okay. I think when they were younger, they didn't understand why I was gone, and it was bizarre for them. Now they get it, and they're kind of into it. My son's putting together, the kids, both of them, they're putting together a scrapbook of all my reviews and interviews and all the little stuff. So they're going to surprise me with it when I get home.
What are your children reading now?
Well, my daughter reads, is now like on the 5th book of Harry Potter, I think. So she's going through the whole Harry Potter thing, which she's loving. My son, I'm a little reluctant to say because he's such a precocious reader. He's been reading books that really should be read by adults, but he's, like I said, he's like a middle-aged man. I think he's reading the new book about Zelda Fitzgerald. Yeah.
It's a great book.
He kind of like fell in love with that whole era and that whole lifestyle because he read The Paris Wife and he watched Midnight in Paris, the Woody Allen movie. And then that's like all he wanted to watch, and he's a little strange. But we'll see if he finishes it. But he told me he really liked it. And then he just finished like in the new Stephen King as well.
Wow.
Joyland.
Wow. He's a diverse
He's like he picks after his mom. He's a very fast reader. He's already read the new Dan Brown as well.
Speaking of reading, might we twist your arm and get you to read a little bit?
I'd be happy to.
Hear your voice?
I'd be happy to. So, let's see. Maybe I'll tell a little bit about the book, and then I'll set up the section that I'm going to read. Just a quick show of hands. How many people have actually read this book already? Okay, that's what I thought. The majority haven't. So the book is set as a series of chapters that are linked and connected to each other. It begins with it's almost shaped like a tree. There's a trunk, and that trunk is the relationship between these two children. There's a boy who's 10 years old and his little sister who's 3, and they live in a very modest, impoverished village in an isolated part of Afghanistan. We meet them in 1952. They're extremely close. They've lost their mother when she gave birth to the little girl. So the boy has been basically more or less been like the father and the mother to his little sister, and she worships him. And he looks after her, he cleans her, he feeds her, and all the things that parents do. And they live with their father and their stepmother, who's kind of, I suppose she's not outright evil to the children, but she doesn't go out of her way a whole lot to be nice to them. And her name is Parwana, the stepmother. When we meet the kids, they're in the fall of 1952, they're on their way to Kabul with their father. They're walking across the desert. They go into Kabul, where the father has ostensibly found work. But what neither child is aware of is when they get to Kabul, something is going to happen there that is going to rupture this beautiful relationship that they have. It's going to tear one from the other. And they will not see each other for a long time. And each of the two children is affected in a different way by this act of separation. And in some ways, it shapes really the people they end up becoming. So that separation between the two children ends up being sort of the looming presence over the rest of the novel. And it has echoes and ripples across time and across generations into the lives of a whole series of other characters that we get to meet, each of whom is granted a chance to speak and contribute their part of one big story. So it's a series of connected, more or less freestanding vignettes that tell one big story. One of those chapters is about the children's stepmother, Parwana, who herself had a sister, a twin sister, in fact. And Parwana and her twin sister had a kind of one of those sibling relationships that was very love and hate. Parwana was extremely homely. She's very plain looking, socially awkward, difficult for her to make friends. Whereas Masuma, her sister, is a knockout. And she's everybody's favorite. She's very popular in the village. Everybody loves her, and everybody worships her everywhere she goes. And this obviously has an impact on how Parwana views herself and how she views her sister. And this chapter kind of gives you, a little bit more of compassion and empathy for Parwana, so that the first impression of her that you have as a stepmother is tempered and mitigated by the fact that you learn in the subsequent chapter that this person has a whole set of reasons and kind of why the way she turned out the way she did. So I'll read a brief passage about the relationship between the two sisters. See if I can find this page. I should have marked the page. Okay, I got it.
could you share with the audience in case anyone would like to read along?
Page 56. When the girls were 9 years old, the family gathered at Sabur's family. I'm sorry, this is the wrong passage, sorry about that. I had one page wrong there. By the time she and her sister were 11, Parwana had developed a precocious understanding of the strange behavior of boys around girls they privately liked. She saw this especially as she and Masuma walked home from school. School was really the back room of the village mosque, where in addition to teaching Quran recitation, Mullah Shakir had taught every child in the village to read and write, to memorize poetry. The village, Sharbab, was fortunate to have such a wise man for a malik, the girl's father told him. On the way home from these lessons, the twins often came across a group of boys sitting on a wall. As the girls passed, the boys sometimes heckled, sometimes threw pebbles. Parwana usually shouted back and answered the pebbles with rocks, while Masuma always pulled her elbow and told her in a sensible voice to walk faster, but not let them anger her. But she misunderstood. Parwana was angry not because they threw pebbles, but because they threw them only at Masuma. Parwana knew they made a show of the living, and the bigger the show, the deeper their desire. She noticed the way their eyes ricocheted off her and trained themselves on Masuma, forlorn with wonder, helpless to pull away. She knew that behind the crass jokes and the serious grins, they were terrified of Masuma. Then one day, one of them hurled not a pebble but a rock. It rolled to the sister's feet. When Masuma picked it up, the boys snickered and elbowed one another. An elastic band held a sheet of paper wrapped around the rock. When they were at a safe distance, Masuma unrolled it. They both read the note. I swear, since seeing your face, the whole world is fraud and fantasy. The garden is bewildered as to what is leaf or blossom. Distracted birds can't be distinguished, the bird seed from the snare. A Rumi poem, one from Mullah Shakir's teachings. They're getting more sophisticated, Masuma said with a chuckle. Below the poem, the boy had written, I want to marry you. And below that, he had scribbled this addendum. And I've got a cousin for your sister. He's a perfect match. They can graze my uncle's field together. Masuma tore the note in half. Don't mind them, Parwana, she said. They're imbeciles. Cretins, Parwana agreed. Such effort it took to plaster a grin on her face. The note was bad enough, but what really stung was Masuma's response. The boy hadn't explicitly addressed his note to either one of them, but Masuma had casually assumed that he had intended the poem for her and the cousin for Parwana. For the first time, Parwana saw herself through her sister's eyes. She saw how her sister viewed her, which was how the rest of them did. It left her gutted, what Masuma said. It flattened her. So it's sort of this relationship between these two sisters, one of these sort of sibling relationships where, you know, love and hate come in equal measures, and of these volatile, contradictory dynamics.
Overheard someone earlier ask about your connection with siblings. You're not exactly an only child, are you?
No. Nobody is in Afghanistan. No, I'm the oldest of five, and by Afghanistan, we actually had a small family. So I'm the oldest of five, and I have 3 brothers, and I have a sister. They all live in California. And I can't say that I really drew on my specific aspect of my relationship with my sibling, but certainly we went through a whole series of, you know, stuff that siblings go through, which is completely normal. I'm actually very, very close with we text each other and call each other pretty much every day, with all four of them. I have a very kind of unique relationship with each one of them. We're all very close. But it's a relationship that's, that's rooted in these sort of transformative experiences that shape us, that shape adults that we become. There's secrets, and there's rivalries, and there's, jealousy and envy and love and sort of altruism, and it's just a whole slew of really dynamic stuff that to me is great material for story making.
The sibling and family part of this book is just overpowering, and we assume, those of us who have read it, assume you drew on those experiences and the generational part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I guess all three of my books, and this one is no exception, this is a sort of multi-generational family story. All three of my books have been family stories. I mean, they've been about a lot of political turmoil in Afghanistan, this to a lesser extent. But it's really at heart, they're really stories about family. And the reason why I keep being interested in that is because I think the way that I was raised. When I grew up in Kabul, I was born in '65 and I lived there until I was 11. And my sort of memory of that life is that it was extremely rich socially. When I grew up in Kabul, I didn't think of myself as kind of an isolated individual. I thought of myself, and the only way that made sense to myself, and the only way my life made sense, was if I thought of myself as part of something bigger. I wasn't just a person, I was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's cousin, somebody's nephew, somebody's second cousin. We had people in the household all the time, and we were never, ever alone. I can't remember eating dinner alone with my parents in the 11 years that I lived in Afghanistan. There was always people around, cousins, second cousins, aunts, uncles. They were always dropping in unannounced, and you just hold a plate for them and they sat down and ate with you. And so it was very rich socially. And the way you understood yourself, the way you made sense of the world was through this very dynamic organism, which was the family. And therefore, to have a disruption in this kind of narrative of the family, to have something splinter it, and have problems within the family, to have friction and sort of these kind of dramatic acts within the family, it to me is dramatically so rich as a source of stories.
I think those of us who have read the book would definitely call it an incredibly rich book.
Yeah, and it's still part of me, the way I think of myself, the way I've made a lot of decisions in my life. A lot of them have had to do with my family. I mean, I live in Northern California and I love it there, but there's other places that I've thought about going, and I feel bound to Northern California because my mother's there, and because I have 3 brothers there. And I can't imagine just uprooting and leaving them and going and live somewhere where I won't see them all the time. I mean, I need to see them all the time. It's sort of part of my life, and I need to see my sister. It's just the way I was raised. And so to me, to see myself outside the context of this group of people who are my family and also the extended family, it's kind of odd, and it's difficult for me to imagine. And so when I write, I find myself gravitating towards, writing stories about parents and children, or write stories about people who are, siblings, to write stories about how people relate to each other from one generation to the next. I find it so fascinating.
Before we get into some of the audience questions, you stunned me earlier coming from the airport when we talked about the subject. I mentioned that around here we know something about football.
Oh.
And I didn't think you were much of a football fan, but you corrected me quite a bit. Would you share with what you might be working on?
Oh, I hate to admit it. I hate to make it public because it may not happen enough. It's terrible. But No, I'm a football fan. You know, in a way, sports has been sort of the matrix on which I've developed very strong relationships. It was, you know, I remember I was 5 years old and we were in Iran. My family had moved to Iran because my father was a diplomat. And I remember that it was one of my earliest memories that I actually sat with my father and we talked about something, that the World Cup was on in 1970 and we were watching Brazil, I think, play Italy. And he talked me through it. I'd never seen soccer before. And that's where I discovered my love of sports. And I've always been a big sports fan. I was never an athlete, but I've always been a big spectator and loved watching. And when we first came to the States in 1980, my family arrived here from France because while we were in France, where my father had a diplomatic post, the Soviets decided to invade Afghanistan, and that triggered a war that ended up lasting a decade or more. And so my family just couldn't go back to Afghanistan. So those people who didn't go back got executed and got thrown in prison. It was really horrifying. So my father applied for asylum to the States, and we moved to San Jose, California in the fall of 1980. But when we arrived, we were basically not basically, quite literally penniless. And we didn't speak any English, we didn't understand the culture whatsoever. And so it was very hard for me as a 15-year-old to kind of navigate this bizarre, weird high school culture. And it was really sports in some ways, and my affection for sport that helped me along. Because when I came there, within a year, 49ers went to the Super Bowl, you know, and suddenly everybody was talking about Joe Montana, and he became my hero as well. And I remember sitting with my brothers and enjoying this sport that we had just learned, you know, what the rules were and everything. And it kind of united us. It kind of helped us have a common language with our neighbors and with the people around us. And I found out I could go to school and talk to somebody about something that they knew about and I knew about. And it kind of, so I've always loved that kind of communal feel that sports can bring around. And so I, of course, have been a fan ever since, and there's a chance that I might actually be allowed to go to the very last game that the 49ers will play at Candlestick Park before it's destroyed, and to write a story about it. So that's literally, I'm getting giddy about it, thinking about it right now.
We'll keep our fingers crossed that it works out.
I'm glad there's no pro football team here because I'll get booed, you know. It's always dangerous territory when you talk about your favorite pro team, you know, you alienate half the audience or something.
Well, there are many in the audience who might think we have a couple of pro teams.
They're better than one of the pro teams we have in Northern California.
Someone in the audience didn't sign the name. And this was, I'd like to ask this question. How do you get into the mind of a woman? You're so perceptive, especially with regards to Perry, the sister, thinking of her as in her middle-aged self.
I love that woman, Perry. I mean, she was one of my favorite characters in the book, although she's not my favorite character in the book. I do have a favorite character in the book, and I'll be happy to talk about it. Maybe I'll bring her up first and then just kind of talk about how I wrote them. My favorite character in this book is also a woman, but it's not quite Patty. Well, she's close. But my favorite character is Mila, she is very pivotal in what happens to the children in 1952 when they're separated. And Mila is sort of the exact opposite of the image that you would have if I said the words Afghan woman. You know, you might think about somebody who is in a burqa, or, you know, somebody who's sort of this pall of oppression hanging over her and so on. And quite rightfully, that's sort of become the popular image. But Mila is very sexual. She is a poet. She is completely outspoken, totally unafraid. She is a real firebrand. When we meet her, she's also very beautiful, very aggressive in a way. She's very, very smart. opinionated, educated, a raging narcissist. She's probably an alcoholic, and she turned out to be a lousy mom. But she's a really good time, and she's fun. She was a lot of fun to write because she was so full of mischief and contradictions and flights of rage, and so I loved writing her. And she reminded me of a kind of woman that I remember meeting in Kabul back in the 70s, which now seems impossible to believe those women kind of existed. But I remember, at that time, Afghanistan was sort of in the middle of a tug of war between the Soviet Union and the United States. This is during the Cold War. And each of those parties were trying to influence Afghanistan, and so the Soviets would build an apartment complex, and the Americans would build a school, and that sort of. And so the Afghans benefited from that. And there was a kind of influx of Western sensibility into a certain segment of Kabul society to which my family belonged. So I remember going to these parties at my parents' house or at a relative's house, and there would be these very exotic women who wore short skirts, who smoked incessantly, who had these really kind of glamorous drinks, and the way they sipped the glass I found so amazing. And they would have opinions which they would express very loudly, and they would always, in the middle of sort of very animated disagreement with somebody. And I always intimidated by them. But Neela was sort of an embodiment of that kind of woman that I met in the 70s in Kabul. But I struggle, I think, as much as any male writer out there to write female characters, and I certainly have no advantage of any other male in understanding what women are like. So I want to debunk that whole thing already. And my wife tells me all the time that I have no clue. When I wrote 1,000 Splendid Suns, I remember when I was writing it, my agent, who since passed, Elaine Costa, who was really a wonderful woman, and she called me and said, "Are you going to finally tell me what your book is about?" And I said, "Well, okay." And I told her, "Well, it's about Afghan women, and actually it's about two different women, and I'm going to tell a story about each of their perspective." And I was kind of getting excited talking about the book as I was, and she was very quiet at the other end of it. And I said, "You don't like the idea? What's going on?" She said, no, I love it, but men really struggle writing women. And in a kind of a rare moment of outright hubris, I kind of went, I think it'll be fine, I'll do okay. And then I actually started getting into the book, and I was really, really struggled a lot, because I was like obsessed with, I've got to think like a woman, Come on, how will a woman react to this situation? I resorted to ridiculous things, like I started watching The View a lot. As if that was going to help. And at some point, I just gave up. And what kind of became the turning point is I spent a lot of time with these women in my mind. They occupied a real kind of space in my life, Marianne and Lela did. And I had sort of this internal dialogue with them over the span of 1, 2, 3 years. And as we spent more time together, I kind of began to know them. And at some point, it just magically happened, where I just got them. I knew who they were. And I stopped worrying so much about the whole gender thing, and I just got them as human beings. And I felt like everything cleared between me and the characters. And suddenly, I knew that things were going to work out, because I started reading what I'd written past 10 days, and suddenly my voice wasn't on the pages anymore. That horrible, cringing feeling of that some character is talking and they sound just like you, which is horrible. And I started noticing that these characters are behaving on their own now, and I'm getting to that point where these women are becoming real people in my head. And it was at that point that the characters then dictated the plot. And I don't know how my books are going to end. I never outline anything. I don't even know what I'm going to write the next day, let alone how the book's going to end. I just trial and error. I just fumble my way around until I hit something that feels right. And so I didn't know how this book was going to end. I really had no clue And it wasn't until that moment when I began to know these women that I said, oh, I see how this is going to go, and one of them is going to have to give herself up for the other one. And having gotten to know them, I think I know which one it has to be. And there's really no other way this book can end. And at that point, I cried a lot because I really loved them both. I really did, and I especially loved Marianne. Like I grew so close to her. She felt to me so real. And she felt to me like a woman that I had met when I was a boy, like the kind of woman that I would meet on the street, or the kind of woman who might have worked in my household. You know, this kind of very modest woman from a village. And I really loved her a lot. And when the ending became clear, and it, you know, it hit me big time emotionally. So everything that my readers feel when they read my books, I felt tenfold already. You know, I become very attached to them. That's a long, long answer. But that's sort of, I'm sorry. That was sort of, you know, a roundabout way of explaining how I wrote those women.
Well, that was a great insight that you know I'll carry home, and I started say, look in your next book, and that's the next question. Are you working on another book?
Well, that was going to be a very short answer, so you better start looking at the next one. Because I'm on a book tour. I don't know, like I told you, I'm happy to shower.
Well, I guess we'll wait another 6 years.
No, I'm hoping you won't have to. It actually didn't take me 6 years to write this book. It took me 2.5. But in 2007, I traveled nonstop to promote 1,000 Splendid Suns, and then the movie of Kite Runner came out. And so I traveled a whole bunch for the movie, and I ended up doing a lot of work for the UN that year as well. And so it just, I put in so many miles that I forgot. 2008, I didn't do a whole lot. My dad got really sick, and he ended up passing away late 2009. So I spent the better part of 2 years helping my mom take care of him. And so for a large chunk of that period, I just didn't want to write anything. I started a few things half-heartedly, and I lost all my passion for it. A novel that I started, and it just kind of ended up stillborn, and I just abandoned it after a point. And I really didn't start this book until late 2009. And so it took me about 2.5 years to write. So the 6-year gap wasn't, you know, like I was ruminating over it. Hopefully it won't be as long as this time.
Well, we hope not.
Yeah, I hope not too.
We'll see what we can do to talk with your publicist and arrange another Birmingham trip, and if the same multiplication table works, maybe we'll have you at Legion Field. Seats about 70,000. Why do you always write about Afghanistan?
Well, it's not that I ever really want to write about Afghanistan, with the exception of, I will say that of the 3 books, 2 of them started with an image that just snowballed into a book, both Kite Runner and A Mountain's Echo. Kite Runner, the image that I had was of 2 boys flying a kite, and I had no idea who they were, but I felt something was amiss between them, and I started writing about it, and it snowballed into something completely unexpected. This book also began with a picture, almost perfectly delivered, with full clarity, and it was a man walking across a desert, and he's pulling a wagon, and one of those little radio flyer wagons, and there's a little girl inside of it. She's about 3, and about a few paces behind there's a boy, and they're crossing a desert, and there's nobody around but the 3 of them. And the image was so arresting and so vivid to me that I just had to sit and write it, and it just kind of snowballed from there. Just all kinds of unexpected things happened. But the only one that I actually meant willfully is set in Afghanistan, and the only one that started not with a small picture that got snowballed, but rather with a big idea that I didn't narrow down, was 1,000 Splendid Suns. Because I really did want to write about the struggle of women in Afghanistan. That was a subject that spoke to me personally at a very deep level. I felt it was an important subject. I found it very riveting. I found it very relevant to the future of Afghanistan. So I thought that's something that I do want to write about. I just didn't have, at the time that I began thinking about it, I didn't have the right story, the characters, all the things that you need And so I just waited around until something came up and I began to think about Mariam and Layla. But I like writing about Afghanistan, although I doubt very much that I'll write about it forever. In fact, this book is sort of the beginning of a divergence from sort of being clinging to Afghanistan, I suppose, because this book in some ways is the most geographically sweeping book of all three. I mean, there's entire sections, sizable sections of the book that are set in Europe, in France, and the Greek islands, and a sizable section that's set in the United States. The heart of the book is still Afghanistan, but the characters in this book have varying ranges of connection to Afghanistan, some none. And so it's just that the ideas that I've had about characters and so on have compelled me, that have to do with what's happening in Afghanistan, which is massive and enormous. I mean, it's a big piece of my life. You know, what's happened in Afghanistan, it's sort of become front and center. And so I found it very compelling, and I sort of tapped into it to create, you know, these characters and these stories set in that world. But I imagine that because I am very, very loath to repeat myself, and I would rather not write at all, to just kind of write the same book that maybe people expect from me. I would just rather not write. That at some point I'll want to write about something else, and I'm sure I will. We'll see what that is. But I don't imagine that I'll write about Afghanistan forever. Unless, I mean, let me just say, it's really not even the setting per se. I mean, I'm not going to shy away from it because, well, I don't want to write about that country again. If there's a story and a set of characters that become a pebble in my shoe that I've got to deal with, or that leaky faucet in your mind, sometimes you're just completely gripped by a set of characters and a story, and it's really just a compulsion more than anything else. You just have to see it through, rather than just kind of devise an idea. It's like, I'm going to write about Afghanistan, it's going to include this character. It never works that way for me.
As a segue, what role does religion play in your books?
Well, I think it's fairly self-evident. It's not major. You know, I've shied away from writing about religion a whole lot. I mean, I think of myself as a cultural Muslim more than a practicing Muslim, really. You know, when I grew up in Kabul, and Afghanistan is a pious country. I mean, people are quite religious, but it's a little bit different than, you know, it's not, if you sort of erase the image of the Taliban and everything that happened there, you know, which was an anomaly in Afghanistan. People are pious, but they're surprisingly tolerant. I mean, historically, traditionally, they have been. Religious is diffuse in the society, but there's no rigid religious hierarchy in Afghanistan like there is in many other Islamic countries. And when I grew up in Kabul, my family was, I would say, more or less, not secular. My parents prayed intermittently, but they did pray. My mother was, my grandmother was a 5 times a day, you know, get up and pray, and fully functioning Muslim, practicing Muslim. But it was never kind of, in our household, was never enforced. You know, my parents never said, you know, you have to get up and pray. They never said you have to fast during Ramadan. It was kind of left up to us. If we wanted to, we were free to. And if we didn't, we weren't blamed for it. I'm not saying that's good or bad. It was just the way we were raised. And so the end result was that religion played a role in my life, but it was never central. And so you write about things that you feel very strongly about. And because religion occupied a certain space in my life, but not a central one, it's not a central part of what I write about either. I mean, it's difficult to write about Afghanistan without the religious context because that plays into so many things, but it's not something I'm interested in exploring.
For a complete change of pace, someone wants to know, what is your favorite book?
Well, it's been 12 years since I began writing and 10 years since I last published. And I promised myself that I would find a clever answer to this question at some point, so I don't sound like an idiot every time, because I know the question's coming. They'll say, well, who inspired you as a writer, and what's your favorite book? And I should have an answer by now. It's almost, frankly, it's unforgivable. But it's hard for me to pick a favorite book. What I can say is some of the stuff that I read when I was a kid has really stayed with me, and one or two things in particular, and has actually influenced my approach to storytelling. Probably my favorite thing to read when I was a kid, or favorite thing to have my father or my grandmother read to me when I was a kid, was something that a lot of people in the West, and not just in the West, but in Europe as well, have very little awareness of. And it happens to be one of the crowning jewels of Persian literature, and it's called the Shahnameh. I wrote about it in the Kite Runner. It translates into the Book of Kings, and it was written over 1,000 years ago by a poet named Ferdowsi, who wrote this massive magnum opus, this big epic, that began with the dawn of time and ended around the 7th century with the Arabic invasion of Persia, and has over 500 characters, has a ton of mythical creatures in it. There's a lot of mythology. It has princes and kings and princesses and queens and warriors and battles and all this kind of court drama and all this stuff. Amazing stories, which I grew up around. My favorite of them was the story that I sort of alluded to in the Kite Runner, which is called the story of Rustam and Sora, who were father and son, although they didn't know it. They were two great warriors who wanted to honor each other, and they never met in the course of their life, and they ended up meeting at a battlefield, the first time they did meet, and the father mortally wounds his son without knowing that's his son. And the moment during which he holds his son's dying body and learns that this is in fact his son, and the sort of incredible emotional breakdown that he has at that moment is, to me, one of the unmatched moments in literature, and one that always affects me no matter what. So that was my favorite story, and I think I took a lot of cues from Ferdowsi and from the Book of Kings, in the sense that my instinct always is to tell a story. And he wrote a lot about fathers and sons and families and so on, and my instinct always is to write about those things. I don't know if I've been directly influenced by Ferdowsi and the Book of Kings, but I know that it's spoken to me very deeply as a child, and still does as an adult, and it remains one of my favorite things to read in the world. There is actually now, I'll plug my publisher, Penguin, has published an amazing translation called the Shahnameh. It's beautiful, it's illustrated, and it's just a wonderful, it's a wonderful translation. I can give you the name.
That's a great point to end this. I know we'd like to stay all night and keep you here for the next 3 or 4 days, but I know you're on an incredible schedule. We're so thrilled to have you.
It was fun.
Birmingham, and please, when you get that idea for your next book, please come back to me.
Oh, thank you. No, I know it's a real pleasure to come back to Birmingham, and I'm certainly very touched, as I said earlier, by the turnout of all of you. Those of you who read the book, I hope you enjoyed it. The rest of you, I hope you do like the book. It's, just to say a couple of words about it before we leave off, it's similar to my previous 2 books in some ways, in that it's full of intense emotions, and it's a little bit different in other ways. It's, as I said, the structure is different, and some of the things about it, but I think that's just kind of my natural growth as a writer and my transformation as a writer, but I think you'll hear my voice on the pages of this book. I hope you enjoy the book. I hope it speaks to you. I hope you see something of your life and of yourself on these pages. I hope to see some of you again on the road in the future. Thank you so much.
He broke all records in signing books today, so we have more signed books for sale. 1,286 books. And I bragged about it, and I said he signed them in 50 minutes, and he corrected me because he was timing. 45 minutes.